Welcome back to React Native Radio Podcast. Brought to you by OpenAI's legal team. Did you know that DeepSync stole the IP we already stole? Just not fair. Episode 321, Expo DOM with Evan Bacon.
Hey everybody, we're back with another React Native Radio episode. I'm Jamon, and I do not have any of my lovely co-hosts with me. Mazen and Robin are off doing, I have no idea what. They're probably just goofing off while I'm here, stuck in this chair, having to sit down and actually talk about stuff that I really enjoy talking about. So, you know, I'm happy. And I'm not alone. I actually have with me Evan Bacon. Evan, thanks for coming on. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me again. It's always a pleasure talking with you.
One thing that's always awesome about doing podcasts with you is I know that I don't have to carry the conversation too much. You have such great insight into React Native. You're always working on something interesting. And yeah, I don't know. I'm looking forward to it. It's going to be a fun one. Before we get into that, I do want to say that this episode is brought to you by my company, Infinite Red. We are a premier React Native consultancy located fully remote in the US. We have 30 senior plus React Native developers and support staff and have been doing this for nearly a decade. Why does it say nearly a decade? I think my notes are wrong. It's 2025. I need to update that. It's been a decade now, so, you know, I should update that. If you're looking for React Native expertise, hit us up at infinite.red/radio. And don't forget to mention that you heard about us through this podcast. All right, Evan, we're going to be talking about DOM components in React Native. And we're going to some people in the audience have probably been following along with you on Twitter and probably, you know, understand what you're doing. I mean, I guess for the folks that don't know Evan Bacon, no, this is not the actor Kevin Bacon. This is Evan Bacon. I'm sure you've gotten that joke plenty of times.
No, first time, actually. That's crazy. Who's Kevin Bacon?
No. Exactly. And he works at Expo, and he does all kinds of cool stuff. I don't know. Evan, can you like just really quickly list off all the different things you've been involved, not all of them, but just a list of things you've been involved with at Expo and otherwise?
Yeah. So I'm the creator of Expo Router, which is our navigation solution, which is, you know, the universal framework. Let's see, before that, I rewrote the CLI. Before that, I made pre-build. So I think my first really big project at Expo was just getting rid of the eject command. You know, with Expo eject, just
the
deleting
infamous
that
eject button. Yeah.
Yeah, just removing that and replacing it with a system that has none of the same limitations. So you can use any custom native code and you get smaller apps. And then I worked on like auth session and some of our authentication stuff. And now I've done DOM components and working on server components in Expo as well. I also made Expo Web, so like added the web platform, and been working on trying to really get that to a place where Expo Web is really one of the best possible ways to build a website. And we're making really great progress on that. But also just bringing a lot of the web, the good parts, keeping that alive and well in React Native. But before that, I was just like iOS developer. So I'm definitely very much fascinated by mobile development and apps that kind of travel with you.
Yeah, it's fantastic. And you've given talks about some of these things over the years, so I do encourage people to go look those up. I recently found out you have a Wikipedia page, and it's not even for your development work. Apparently you were like a Lego artist. Is that what you call it?
Yeah, just like Lego art. I think when you work at Lego, you're like a proper Lego master builder.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, you're a proper one. But yeah, it's just something I did as a kid. Wanted to like build. I was fascinated with the idea of just building like large scale Lego statues and sculptures.
Right.
I think I saw like just some video or something where it's like they did the de-resing, and you notice that it's like, oh, you can create like a circle with like jagged edges if you just like squint or whatever. And I was like, what if you did like a whole person with that? So I did that from like 12 to like 18.
Wow.
But yeah, might get back into it. I don't know. There's a lot of interesting things to build.
Wow. Yeah. I mean, there's probably some parallels there. There's probably, you're building things with components and you're kind of composing it together from smaller pieces. Yeah, it seems like it just kind of fits.
Yeah, you just kind of chip away at the mountain, I guess. I have some of them stood up in my house. Like we got a big one back here.
That's awesome.
And yeah, they're I don't know. Sometimes I'm also kind of blown away by it. So yeah, it was just like, you can basically do anything if you really just like stick to it long enough.
Story of my career. Yeah. Totally. All right, let's talk DOM components. So first up, can you kind of give, for people who aren't familiar with this concept at all, obviously they're listening to React Native Radio. They understand that React Native is building with native views. Like you write React and then it renders a native view from that, and you kind of coordinate and orchestrate it from the JavaScript side of things. But what's a DOM component? What's this all about?
Yeah. So DOM components are it's a React component, and at the top you mark it with a use DOM directive, kind of like use client or use server.
Right. It's just like a string, right? Like quote, use DOM quote, right?
Yeah. And then when you import it, it renders that component and all of its children inside of a web view, so using React Native Web View under the hood. And the benefit of this is like whenever I would use Web View, like my idea of this is that it's like, oh yeah, you could just use React code in your app, but actually it's like a Web View ingests a URL or it ingests like HTML. So all the kind of modern standard features that you expect, like the bundling and data fetching and being able to handle like aliases and TypeScript, all that you have to do yourself. So with the DOM component, you can share all of your existing bundler code and utilize that from that component down. And what's really fantastic with this is that you can basically just take your website and immediately run it on native inside of a DOM component, similar to like one of these old school web view approaches like PhoneGap, but without the major drawback where with PhoneGap you would have to start from scratch and just kind of throw away everything that you did. With this, you can go up the component tree or down the component tree. You can go whichever way you want through the component tree, incrementally migrating components over to native. And then if you're using Expo Router, you can go route by route, changing the routes over to native. So, if one screen is working just fine for you as a web view, you can leave it that way. But if you want to change your main page, you don't have to like start from scratch and learn a totally different system. So yeah, it really takes kind of full advantage of React's composability model to jump between the boundary of native and web.
We're going to talk a bunch about incremental migration for sure. But before we get there, I want to make sure that we're super, super clear here on exactly what's happening. This is running in a web view. This is not translating web code into native views. This is taking basically web code and using it on web as a web view. Now, is this local? It's not pulling from some server, right?
Yeah, currently it's all local. So at build time, this is actually probably the hardest part to get right, but at build time, it will bundle each DOM component separately and then embed them inside of your app so that they just load from disk, and then take all the assets that you required and pull those in as well. But yeah, it is all web code. And this is kind of part of like maybe a larger migration story. If you think about, like React strict DOM and this idea of like universal div and universal image, those won't support every possible thing that the browser can do, because if they did, you would effectively just be rebuilding the browser.
Exactly.
And the browser's already like very optimal at doing what the browser does. And so there are going to be trade-offs. And so when you combine something like DOM components with strict DOM, you get this flow where you can see, you can like strict DOM runs on web. So you can convert your code to universal inside of web. And then when you remove the directive, you can immediately see if it works on native. And if it just like blows up and there's all these errors and you're like, okay, never mind, you can put it back and like continue migrating on the web space. So it really helps streamline this migration from web over to native by having it share as much as possible. It's all the little things that you don't think about, right? It's like environment variables are missing, your tsconfig paths are missing, any custom aliases you set up are missing. So all of those are totally shared. All your deployment and build is shared. It really just comes down to the components being different and some of the styles, which when you isolate it like styles, that, it's like super easy to wrap your mind around the migration.
Speaking of styles, like you have CSS, like is it an external file? You're just using regular CSS, or what's going on with that?
Yeah. If you're doing styling in a DOM component, it's just like it's totally web. So you can use anything that Expo Web can do. And Expo Web is a super high powered web framework at this point. So you can pull in like inline CSS. You can use global CSS. You can use CSS modules, Sass, Post CSS, Tailwind, like anything. And we're adding server functions to it as well. So you will be able to do server rendering inside of them as well. So you could really just take modern React code from like any framework and then put it inside of your app and migrate it over to native.
So I, along with Thibaut, was involved with the React Native Web View for quite a while. Now Thibaut does almost all of it. I don't do a lot of it anymore. But the React Native Web View it's a big beast. There's a lot to it. It's got a huge surface area, API surface area. There's so many different things you can do with it. You would think, oh, I just drop in a web view and then I have all of the browser features. I have and it's just not true. Like a web view is not a browser. It's not even close to a browser. There's so many things that browsers do for you. Just as an example, cookies, like it's just not built in. You have to actually build cookies around it. And WebView has an implementation that's not that, okay. I'm not going to get into all of the details, but
right.
WebView is kind of headed that direction, but there's just no way that you can provide everything a browser does in the WebView, even if you're not handling the rendering, even if you're allowing the WebView to do the rendering. So knowing that, I have to ask you, did you use some specialized stripped down, Evan Bacon infused version of WebView, or are you using React Native WebView?
Yeah. So behind the scenes, there are two different web views that you can use. One is experimental. It's something we've just been playing around with. And the other is the default is React Native WebView. And, like to your point, it is very large, but web views kind of have like two purposes. One is this embedded content flow and the other is this remote flow. And so you have all these you have all these like API interfaces, things where it's like location permission allowed and like tons and tons of location, like different types of permissions that you can turn off. And those don't really make sense in the context of embedded content because it's all your own content. They make a lot of sense when you're loading someone else's website and it's like you could navigate anywhere. So you're not sure, like what might be loaded. So you may turn everything off by default. So in DOM components where we do use this embedded flow, you can think of it as a much more stripped down version of like what users will end up needing from the web view. So we can turn a lot of settings on by default or off by default and have a much more opinionated interface. So I found that simplified things because like, a lot of this when we were first playing with the idea, there'd be little things like the scrolling is just not quite the right velocity or acceleration speed as you would expect, right? It's like some different value. So we try to really match it to a much more opinionated set of rules so that you just get kind of what you would expect. So for example, like scroll view in iOS on React Native, it doesn't by default account for like large header and then, built-in navigation footer. And so you have to like go in and set params for that. But DOM components do. So they like work better with other native components. We really try to make it feel as native as possible, even though it is a web view, just so that you get something that you feel like generally proud of. So that you feel more motivated to migrate to native. You're like, oh yeah, you know what? I'm liking this native scroll feel. I like the way it interacts with other native components. Because you do get one native scroll in a web view, at least on iOS, right? The body scrolling is a UI scroll view. You get the one, so you got to like utilize it correctly, right? Yeah. Everything else is the JS scroll, and it is noticeable, very noticeable.
And that, I guess, brings up a point. Like, I thought we were trying to get away from this. I thought that doing web views, that was the enemy. That was the thing that everybody said we should do, and then it just didn't work. So why are we going back to this? Like, this feels like a step backwards. Why would you ever do a web view in a React Native app?
Yeah, great question. I think that there's like, if you look at someone who goes from, maybe not being a developer to getting to making apps, then maybe they try a web view approach and then they get really burned on it because the only way out is to start from scratch. And then they find a tool like React Native. This gives you a much more incremental and smoother bridge over, just because you're already able to, with React Native, pretty specific to React Native in a lot of ways, write really high-powered native apps with JavaScript. So we're able to leverage that on both sides of the web view aisle and the native aisle. But then also, there are elements of WebView that just feel like, frankly, really bad, at least as of like today, regardless of your approach, your mix match approach. And the main one is navigation. Like getting the right navigation goes a really long way into making your app look and feel really native. So with DOM components, we restrict a lot of the navigation, and we try to make it just like a standalone component. And then you can do things like access Expo Router's link component to move between pages. It's a file-based router. And when you call those, they send a signal up to the native app, and then it navigates using native navigation. So we do try to enforce that you have native scrolling, native navigation, and really just as much native as we can without, being too scary, too heavy-handed with like how native stuff works. And then there are, it does have this kind of cool ability to pass data back and forth. So, like WebView doesn't have access, for instance, to like native haptics. But with DOM components, you can just define a function as a component on that component, and then it can call like haptics, and then you can ingest it and call that function, and then it will like make a haptic effect. So we have like some sort of serial transport layer, which is like asynchronously passing values back and forth between web and native, which is then fully typed because of how hidden away this is inside the bundler. And then that allows you to like make your app even more native. So for example, say you already built like a website, like a blog or some sort of maybe like cooking website, and it's really popular and you got a lot of users, and you're like, okay, I want to make this an app because I want to send users like notifications, or I want to have like live activities come in. You don't want to like start from scratch and then re-implement like your CMS or whatever you're using to do all the data fetching. With DOM components, you can just run it in your app and then expose just the notification functionality, and you can try it and you can be like, okay, does this make sense? And if so, if it doesn't, then you can just stop right there. And if it does, then it's like, great, now you can like start migrating over more and more. So you get this really fine, like intention driven pathway to going from, idea to full-fledged product.
That sounds really cool. Can you actually just define like an async function and then just call it from web and have it just run in native? Or is there a little more wiring up that needs to happen like that?
Yeah, so you just like import the component if it says use DOM at the top, and then you define as a prop. You could have like, on
as
press.
a prop. So you pass it in as a prop.
Yeah, as a prop
No
to
way.
the
That's
DOM
super
component.
cool.
And then it ingests the prop and you can call on press, and then it will do whatever is on the native side.
It just has to be async though. Right?
It has to be async, and then the props. So it can also return values. So it take params and it can return values. Those all have to be serializable, right? Because it's going over sort of like a serialized async bridge.
Right.
So you can't pass complex data types, which I think is fine, because that also helps a lot with the migration of like going from web to, if you really start to like dig in, then you're like, oh, well, so we try to keep it, a tester, like a light feeling where you can move back and forth. But yeah, it's really nice to just go from web to trying a native API, right? Like in many ways, it feels like a composable browser where you have your web, all your browser features, but you just need that one new iOS feature. Give it a shot.
Mm-hmm. Do you think there's ever any hope that you could do like a synchronous call? Like do a bridgeless almost?
So that is kind of where you mentioned like having a custom web view. We do have this experimental web view that Kudo-chan built where it can instantiate like, for instance, constants onto the module, like in the global scope, and then you can just import, Expo modules directly without having to go over the boundary. It's all very experimental. This did technically work. There's kind of a history with iOS web views where there's like the WK web view, the more recent one. And then before that, there was UI web view. And with UI web view, you actually had access to the global, and you could theoretically do JSI with it. Like you could just install all the React Native modules. Yeah, theoretically, like you just had, like you could just install things right onto that global. With the new one, everything, has like some sort of like similar transport method with WK web view. So you don't actually have direct access to the global. So you can't install methods right onto the global. If we built like a custom web view on iOS, we could, and then on Android, this is possible. Okay. Because again, it's very similar to the fundamentals of React Native, where React Native has a global, which is then shared, and you can install functions on it using C++. and yeah, that would technically work with the web view as well. But again, like this isn't, this is just like a nice way to migrate over. We don't need to like turn this into like super crazy tech. And in a lot of ways, like this isn't, I think if I were to have had this idea and then gone out and built it from scratch, it would have not really made a lot of sense, because probably would have taken like maybe 8 months to a year to get working. Because a lot of the magic is less about like the serial transport layer and how like use DOM works. A lot of the magic is the universal bundler and Expo CLI being universal.
Right.
And the fact that the same dev server has this multi-dimensional graph where you can like request with different parameters, and then the bundler will like change its transform and resolution serialization to return a web bundle from the same code base, or an iOS or an Android bundle. Like that's where, it's like for instance, if Expo Web didn't have CSS, then we would have DOM components, but you wouldn't be able to use CSS in them. They would just be limited to style sheet. And so it's really, DOM components is kind of a combination of all these other incredible technologies that we just have kind of lying around inside of Expo CLI and like mixing them together.
Yeah, totally. And I do want to kind of keep the audience informed that really what we're doing here, or what you're doing here, is you're making it so that migration is easier. You're not necessarily trying to make a competitor to, React Native's renderer. You're not trying to kind of like, you wouldn't start an app. Well, I don't know. You probably wouldn't start an app and just be like, I'm just going to make all these like use DOM components and have the whole thing kind of orchestrated. So that basically, you'd have this kind of mix between WebView and native from the start. It's really more when you already have a bunch of components, you already have some things that work. They rely on web technologies. And so converting them to native would take a tremendous amount of work. So what you do is you start with, okay, well, we'll just put them into the native app, into their spot, like into that rectangle that we put in this, tab view, into this drawer view, whatever. We stuck it in there. And then when we ship it, right? Because that's usually what's going on, is like we have a ship date. Let's get it done. Boom, we send it out there. And then we're like, okay, I'm using the app. This screen doesn't feel as good as it should. Mm-hmm. Let's do that screen. Let's make that screen better. And there's some screens you never touch. You never touch again. They stay in WebView. They can stay in WebView because, 1% of your users use it once a year. Like who cares? That screen needs to exist, but it doesn't need to have that same level of experience. And then, to be honest, there are some views where WebView will be just fine. It will actually perform in a way that you wouldn't even notice. There's not enough animation, scrolling, whatever, interaction with native stuff. You will never notice that something is a web view in those cases. So why invest the effort? You already have the component built. That's essentially what we're talking about here, right?
Yeah, definitely. And I appreciate all the extra nuance, because it is like tricky to get this story exactly right. But yeah, and it's not like a one size fits all. It's very much like React. There's lots of different ways that you can utilize it. Because like you said, there are some cases where DOM components are actually in some ways maybe closer to what you want. So for example, if you were like rendering Markdown, like web views just have a lot of that view recycling built in. If you were rendering a rich text editor, a lot of rich text editing is like pretty gnarly. And when you start building it out
yes,
like natively, you start to realize, like this is actually very similar to what a web view is doing natively. Maybe the web view is good for something like this. And especially if you measure like time versus complexity, then maybe it does make sense to ship like maybe rich text editor very quickly with a DOM component, and then, move over and natively if you're seeing that feature is actually like working and gaining traction. So yeah, it really just depends. And we just want people to have like another tool in their tool belt. Really the only interface for this is you add use DOM to the top of a component and it just turns on immediately, right? Like you don't have to install another bundler, no extra web setup, everything just starts magically working. And then if you want to turn it all off, delete the use DOM directive and it turns all off, which is pretty fantastic. And like it also helps library authors in React Native a lot as well, because you can get a sense for like areas where the web is just really nice compared to native and very compelling, like in how some of the components and styles work when it's right there. And you can be like, okay, well, when I migrate this over, I see that there's these 2 or 3 things which are hard to migrate over. Like maybe it's like CSS filter prop or something like that. And you're like, I really wish we had this in native. And then there's no reason not to add it to native. So then you do. So bringing the web DX really as close to native as we possibly can, I think will help us identify many more of these missing props that we just want universally. Or maybe you start to see the different flex differences. Like you can write React Native web code inside of a DOM component and then just delete it, and then it will immediately start work theoretically in React Native. But maybe the flex styles are slightly different or slightly off, and you can identify those much more quickly when you're just deleting and adding the use DOM directive.
That's a really good point.
Yeah, so I think this will definitely encourage much better native experiences as well. And then in general, we also just want to, kind of grow the pie and the metaphorical pie, right? And I think a lot of people who are already building React Native apps today, maybe some of them will benefit from this, but a lot of this will go to benefit people who have wanted to get into React Native, but have just found it maybe too tricky to get into, or maybe, like a little hard to find their footing. There's just like hundreds of millions, maybe billions of websites out there. There's incredible content out there. So if you could just run it as an app, maybe you'd be like, okay, maybe this does make a lot of sense as an app. And then then you start to get into it. And cause like, that's how I find I code the best, is when I build something and I get that kind of instant gratification from it. Where I'm like, oh yeah, this is good. It feels good. I can ship this to someone, they can try it. And then I get hit with like, I want this to look and feel really good, because I don't want to be like embarrassed by the quality of it. So yeah, I think this just enables all that.
Do you envision this mostly being used for like full screens, or could you see like a native screen have like 20 little DOM components like being rendered?
Yeah, you can definitely do that. Web views are powerful enough for that, specifically because of that WK WebView UI WebView transition that Apple did. So they do leverage a lot of the same resources behind the scenes. So yeah, I could definitely see that happen. I built a DOM component the other day where I wanted like this cool, like blurry, pixelated gradient at the bottom of my scroll, like for a chat app. So when I scroll through, it gets like incrementally more pixelated as it goes down. And I wanted to use like all the background CSS filter props that are available. Didn't work exactly the same way because it doesn't know how to like blur across the different layers, but it did mostly work, which was fantastic. So in that case, I'm just using it as like one component that I'm absolutely positioning over content that is scrolling natively in the background. It's also great for just different background views. Like if you want like some cool like dot pixel grid in the background, and then you just want to absolutely float it, you can do that too. Maybe there's cases where, like I said, like a rich text editor, like you just want native scrolling, but you want like a rich text editor section in there. You can make that a DOM component. It's a very lightweight web view. So we keep it very, very light. It doesn't even have like built-in React Native web support. It's just strictly React. And
yeah,
it doesn't, there are some caveats to this. So for instance, every web view has its own like global state. So like they don't share a global. And then they also don't have access to React context. So once you get up to the React context on the native side, you access the context and you pass it through as props to the DOM component.
As a prop, yeah.
Exactly. And then that
across that boundary. Right.
Exactly. Yeah. We could probably figure out some way to send it over the boundary, but I think, yeah, we'll just maybe down the line. I think we'll like build this out, see how people use it, because it's also very new. It just came out with 52.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, it seems like people are really enjoying it and getting some pretty good use. Like I just saw an example of this group Inconnect use it, where they have a website and they have this D3 Gantt chart. It's like super interactive, but it's also very important to their website and their product. And they were like kind of stressed about how they were gonna get that working on native, because they're actively developing it, right? Like they're constantly making it better. So when DOM components came out just kind of at the same time, they were able to just pull it into a DOM component and ship it.
That's amazing. That right there, like listeners, like listen to that story right there, because to me, that kind of just showcases the power of this. Even if that was the only thing it could do right there, that's worth it, because right there, they're looking at like, how long will it take to recreate this in React Native? And then also it's changing out from underneath us where, okay, no problem. We put that one in, we ship it. And then later, if we're like, okay, well, web isn't really doing the job, then we can like take our time and do it right and then swap it out when it's ready. It just allows you to do those types of things. I remember way back in the day when I was just not like a native iOS developer, and this was early days. I had this one small view that these days would be pretty easy to implement in native, I think, but but it was sort of like a tag cloud type thing. And I needed to, it was just a part of a bigger screen. And I could not figure out how to do it in native. Like I was doing a bunch of like math I was basically trying to like almost make a yoga, layout system. Yeah. Right. And then I was like, how easy this would be with just like, I mean, it wouldn't have even needed like Flexbox. It would have just been like the old float system, just float it. And so I stuck a web view in there and I just did that. And it wasn't even a thing that was like interactable. Like you couldn't scroll it. Like I turned off scroll. There was no way to tell that was a web view at all. Like it was the same colors. You couldn't scroll it. You couldn't interact with it. It just fit right in and it saved me so much time. So that's a really early like proto version of this, but this is what we're talking about. Like these types of components where, yeah, we've got it working on web. And actually we get asked all the time when people come in and they're like, hey, we want to migrate, but do we pause like development on our, on our web stuff? Like we got to try to keep parity, right? But that's not realistic. So what do we do? And that incremental migration from web, we're talking web, to a React Native thing, it's like, no, keep it rolling. We'll just keep, folding in we'll basically share the code. And then when it's launched and it's ready, then we can take our time to go back and kind of improve the experience if we need to.
Right. Yeah. I mean, like you touched on this a bit, but there's this kind of function of complexity there where it's like if setting up a web view and getting the whole pipeline for distributing and embedding the web view content was part of the complexity that was required to use a web view, then it makes using web view much less compelling. So now
totally.
DOM components, right? It's like pretty equal. You just drop the directive in, you install React Native Web View, and you're good to go. For similarly, just turning it off, like you don't have any extra bloat. There is zero bloat added by like DOM components if you have zero DOM components. There is another caveat there though. With web views, they load slower because it's standard JavaScript instead of a web view. Whereas in React Native, we have Hermes with bytecode, so it parses that pretty much instantly, right? Like it memory maps it to life, and so you will see that. So I think apps that, for instance, maybe you like convert all of your routes instead of Expo router over to DOM components, then you will see like startup take longer, or it'll start up and you'll see like the native navigation pop in, and then the content takes a little bit longer, and then it loads in. And so that's another really compelling reason to then migrate it over to native. And I think that also just punctuates how incredible React Native is that we have Hermes bytecode, right? Like, and that we're able to write JavaScript that just functionally is, really great compared to standard web.
And we don't want to make it too nice over on the website. We still want the native views. No, totally makes sense. So what do you need okay. First off, can you use this without Expo? And then if you are using Expo, like what do you need in order to enable this and just start using it?
Yeah. So like I said, the magic here is really like pulling a bunch of Expo pieces together. So you need Expo CLI and then Expo's bundler setup, which is the default instead of Expo CLI. And I highly recommend that just because if you're using Metro, like Expo is the best way to use Metro. And then you don't need to use Expo Router. It's not explicitly tied to Expo Router, but it does have some nice built-ins with Expo Router, like for instance, navigation. And that's it. So if you were just on a blank Expo project today, you could install React Native Web View, add use DOM, and then that component will be a DOM component. And you're cooking. If you want to build and deploy it, you can EAS build, send it right off, and then it will take care of packaging up all of the different DOM components and then embedding them in the binary and pulling them back out from the local like file system in production. One thing that people should do if they're interested in this and like doing that migration is migrating from not Expo Web to Expo Web, which is a very easy like it's easy to move between different web frameworks, much easier than like native frameworks are. I mean, that's like years of work to move between native frameworks, as you guys well know. Oh, yeah. But yeah, on the web side, Expo Web works functionally very similar to most other React web frameworks. And so if you're using that, then you can just turn it on and off as you see fit, just by sheer nature of needing the universal bundling and the universal components. One thing that I really like about this is I think, there's a lot of flack with React Native Web, for example, because it's not as optimized. It's not as like lightweight and as nice as just using like React DOM directly. And that is totally true, right? Like there's value to things like React Native Web's view, image, and text. And what's nice is if we can amplify that value and deliver that value to people when they want it. So with DOM components, you could just start a website with Expo today and use div, p, image span, just go full web, right? Don't think about universal at all. And then you can migrate it over to DOM components and run it on native. And from there, you'll be like, okay, this is great, but it's starting up slow. I really wish that I could like share code, and I wish I could do this view or this image or this text universally. And then you start to see the value of pieces like React Native Web. At that moment, which is not at the beginning of the project, right? It's not when you're testing or trying something. It's kind of more towards when you are migrating and trying to get into new places. So really meeting users where they are with the framework, I find is really important. So React Native Web is still very important, but it has had this kind of quandary about like when it's valuable to you. And I think DOM components helps mitigate a lot of that.
It absolutely does. Yeah, this really kind of removes so much of the friction, and it also kind of makes it so that your early decisions in a project are not so consequential when you know the least.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I always, when I got into software development, that was always such a pain to me. It was like, you had to decide early on, is this product good for web or native? Because that's a road that you can't easily come back from. And now it's like, with Expo, you just go whichever direction you want, and you can, aggressively reuse components in different platforms. And you can start with, div and span and migrate all the way down to Swift UI, custom UI like views on an iOS device with the latest content. So yeah, really, we really don't want to punish people for just shipping as quickly as possible and trying to build something that makes the world a better place around them.
So unfortunately, we're out of time, but I have one more question for you. When you were making those giant Lego sculptures, did you ever have to... Did you ever get to a point where, like, I guess I assume you're starting at the bottom and like kind of going up, but like if you were making like a giant, I don't know, I'm just like a giant bear or something, you ever have to be like, oh, I got to take this whole thing apart because I started wrong, like the bottom is not right.
Yeah. So I would plot out the center of gravity because that's the hardest part to get right. And then I would build, kind of freehand larger sections, maybe like in like horizontal slices. And then when I was sure about like the shape and generally what I wanted to do, or at least like 80% sure, then I would start going from like the, horizontal layers from the ground up, gluing it as I went. And yeah, you make some mistakes.
Oh, gluing as you went.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. I learned retroactively, I probably should have used something like acetone to kind of like dissolve the bricks together, because then it's a stronger fit and they don't like move over time, shift. But, live and learn. It's probably for the best that I wasn't dissolving ABS in my room as like a 14-year-old. I probably would have got brain damage. So, be careful with that stuff, guys. Use a mask and have good ventilation.
Oh my goodness. Yeah. Well, thanks so much, Evan. I know there's so much more we could talk about with this topic. We barely scratched the surface. There's so much more kind of depth to this, but DOM components are really cool. I think this is a huge step forward for the React Native and Expo communities. And I can't wait to use it on something. Really appreciate you coming on. And of course, if you want to follow Evan, you can go find him on Twitter at Bacon Bricks, which I now realize has to do with his Lego background.
It is a Lego reference. I made it when I was
Bricks as in BRIX, I believe, right? Bacon Bricks. Yeah. Obviously, you can follow React Native Radio also at React Native RDIO. You can go to GitHub and follow him there as well. He does all kinds of cool stuff. So go check all of that stuff out. Yeah. Thanks so much, Evan. Really appreciate having you on.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, and thanks for maintaining React Native WebView. It's a fantastic library.
It was fun. I do have to give credit to Thibaut, who has been really the driving force behind it in more recent years, and there's some others as well have been involved. It was fun. It was challenging though. That thing by itself is almost its own framework, I guess. So yeah, that was an interesting kind of chapter. All right. Well, thanks a lot, everybody. And we will see you all next time.
As always, thanks to our editor, Todd Worth, our assistant editor, Jed Bartosky, our marketing and episode release coordinator, Justin Husky, and our guest coordinator, Mazen Chami. Our producers and hosts are Jamon Holmgren, Robin Hines, and Mazen Chami. Thanks to our sponsor, Infinite Red. Check us out at infinite.red/radio. A special thanks to all of you listening today. Make sure to subscribe to React Native Radio on all the major podcasting platforms.